Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and one of the most infuriating criticisms leveled at the State of Israel by her enemies is that Israel's army, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, somehow are guilty of immoral acts in their conflict with the Palestinians. The charges are infuriating because they're not true. Just as the blood libels of the 14th century on, that Jews use the blood of Christian children to make matzah, is not true. And how do you respond to a lie, to such a ludicrous, outrageous charge? And again, both the blood libel and the criticism of Israel is part of a venal attempt to undermine the State of Israel, an anti-Semitic canard that says that the State of Israel uses disproportionate force in its response to Hamas or Hezbollah or Fatah, or that Israel is targeting innocent civilians, children, medical personnel. But that's part of today's fight against the State of Israel. It's a lie being repeated over and over again by unscrupulous forces whose one and only goal is the delegitimization of the Jewish state, the eradication of the State of Israel from the face of the earth. And in the face of this heinous lie, nothing is more affirming or comforting or legitimizing than when someone outside the Jewish community, with an impeccable and most highly respected reputation, says in no uncertain terms, it is, in truth, all a lie. And all the more so when that someone is an expert, a highly decorated soldier, who knows the complexities of warfare, and who has the courage to correct the lie. On this edition of L'Chaim, it's an enormous honor for me to be sitting with Colonel Richard Kemp, a retired British Army officer who served for some 30 years as an infantry battalion commanding officer, commanding British troops on the front line of some of the world's toughest war zones in the world, including Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, and Northern Ireland. Richard Kemp has been decorated for bravery with the United Nations Protection Force in Bosnia when he was wounded in 1994. And in 2001, he formed a tri-service organization to train 45,000 British troops, deploying on operations each year around the globe. And for most of the last 5 years of his military career, Richard Kemp has been serving in Downing Street as head of the International Terrorism Team at the Joint Intelligence Committee. Richard Kemp is a real military hero and someone looked up to by governments and military forces around the world when it comes to defending peoples from enemies and terrorists who seek their destruction. And Richard Kemp has been a fearless, outspoken defender of the State of Israel in general, and more specifically of the IDF. It is such an honor to see you once again and to have you finally at this table where I've wanted you for so many years. Thank you, Richard, for joining me.
Mark, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to see you again and sit at this very table that I've heard so much about.
Thank you. So first, I want to talk a little bit about you. You know, if you were part of the Jewish world, I would always begin by finding what's your Jewish background and what kind of Jewish home did you grow up with. So a little different having you, but I still want to understand who you are and how you became Richard Kemp. You were born where?
Well, It's my favourite subject, so I'm very happy to talk about myself. I was born in England in a small town called Malden in Essex, which is on the east coast of England, a couple of hours outside London.
And who were your parents?
My father was a master mariner. He'd served in the British Army in the Second World War. He was conscripted, he wasn't a professional soldier. And my mother was a Roman Catholic who was something of a medical expert in her way.
What were their names?
Monica was my mother and my father was John.
Lovely.
And my own attitude towards Israel, which I'm sure you may ask me about a little bit later on, was to a large extent initially formed by my father, who was very, very pro-Israel. To my knowledge, he never met a Jew and he never went to Israel. But he did know what happened to the Jews in the Second World War, and therefore he was always speaking up whenever the opportunity arose in favor of Israel.
That's amazing. You mentioned your mother was Catholic. Your father?
He was Church of England.
Okay.
And we were brought, I was one of 4 children. I had 2 brothers and a sister, still have. And we were brought up as Catholics. My father was, although he was Church of England, he was very, very supportive of us being brought up as a Catholic.
So you grew up in basically a small town.
Yeah.
And then where do you go to school?
I went to school in another town, which is called Colchester, which is the oldest town in the United Kingdom. It's an old Roman town that was a military town going back to Roman times, and today still is. I went to a state school. I didn't go to a private school or anything like that. I went to a state school, albeit a selective school.
Okay. And how do you end up serving in the British Army?
Well, the reality is that I never grew up. I loved playing soldiers. And I just carried on playing soldiers. I never had any aspiration, desire, or intention to do anything other than be a soldier. And in fact, the day I left school, I joined the army. I didn't even go to university. I joined the army and went straight into military training the day I left school.
How did your parents feel about that?
Well, my father was very pleased. He'd been a soldier, as I mentioned, during the Second World War. His father as well was a soldier in the First World War, so he was, very much on side. My mother was extremely supportive, but as all mothers, of course, she was
anxious.
Perpetually anxious.
Yes.
But actually, she was quite a unique woman and never ever showed it to me. I knew she was, but she never showed it. She never said anything. She never showed any overt signs of worrying, but I knew she was. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the kind of things I remember about him, he always used to say, if you see everybody going that way, go that way. In other words, don't just accept what the crowd are saying and doing. Do what you think. And I found
you grew up with that ethic.
I grew up with that, and it certainly kept me in good stead in the army, where I think most people are expected to follow the crowd, and it's sort of almost part of it. But I never did, and it was mainly because of him.
Okay, so you go right from school right into the army, but you go in. You're an enlisted man, yes?
I started off as an enlisted man.
How do you end up an officer?
Well, I wasn't good enough to be a corporal, so they decided they better get rid of me quick and commission me, and I went to Sandhurst, which is our sort of West Point equivalent in Britain Military Academy. Spent about a year there, and then I was patrolling the streets of Belfast, commanding a platoon, facing provisional IRA terrorists.
Was that hard?
It wasn't hard. There were some hard aspects of it. It was actually a really outstanding job, and I've always, this may sound odd to people who haven't fought in the army, I've always enjoyed taking part in active military operations rather than sitting in a barracks or doing training. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason why it was such a good job, it was dangerous. There was lots of sniping and bombing going on at the time, lots of soldiers getting killed at that time. But I was sort of 19 at the time, and I was responsible for 30 men, 30 soldiers, and my duty was to lead them, make them effective in battle, but also to look after them and look after their welfare as well as their military effectiveness. And I found that very gratifying work. But also, perhaps even more so, we were there to maintain law and order. We were there to protect the people, the innocent people of Belfast, as it was when I was there, the innocent people of Belfast from terrorist depredations. And that was an incredibly rewarding thing, to know that you stood between people that wanted to murder them and blow up their houses and maim them, and safety. And we were the instrument of the law out there, which was a fantastic thing to be doing at that age.
Mm-hmm. Richard, you were 19. How old were the soldiers whom you were leading?
Well, they were young men mostly, and I think
All younger than you?
No, the youngest was probably about 18.
Yes.
And many of them were sort of going up to the age of about 26, 27. My platoon sergeant, who was like my second in command, was around about 26, 27. And of course, he'd been in the army a long time, very experienced man. I was a greenhorn, effectively out of school, and he, as mostly this happens with that relationship in the British Army, he guided me and he made sure that I did the right thing. And so I was nominally in command, but he actually had a great deal of influence, shall we say, over what happened.
Okay. Then I read you become a commanding officer in various theaters, correct?
Yeah.
And you, first of all, explain to us, what's it mean to be a battalion commander?
Well, a battalion commander, in effect, commands anything up to around about 800, 900 men, something of that sort.
That sounds like an awful lot of men.
It is a lot, and it's a great job. And it's not a difficult job, or at least I didn't find it difficult, because progressively, from the age of 19, when I was commanding around about 30, you then progressively take command of more and more, and you learn and understand how it all works. So doing that job was not, in my view, wasn't very tough. It was really rewarding. And I think one of the great things about being a battalion commander in the British Army, and I think it's almost a unique status in the British Army compared to other armies, is that you're like the captain of a ship, where your word is basically the last word. And it's more, I'd say, more influential, more sole command than any other command level in the British Army, which is more by committee and with approval of above and below. In a battalion commander, you are, like I said, the captain of a ship.
Okay, when I read that you were in Afghanistan, what did you do in Afghanistan?
I was commander of British forces in Afghanistan, and that was, I was therefore the most senior British officer in that theatre at that time. I was only a colonel, a full colonel, which indicates that there weren't a vast number of troops there. It wasn't like it later became, where there were tens of thousands. When I was there were only something in the region, I think, of 1,500, something like that. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a bit less.
A one-moment digression. I'm wondering, when you were in Afghanistan, as you look back at it, I should say, in retrospect, when the British were there and you were commanding there, was it the right, wise thing to do, or was it in some way in vain, and if you had to do it over again and you could, you would advise against it?
Going into Afghanistan, when we did, with the Americans in 2001, was the right thing to do. I mean, you know, we shouldn't forget, of course, that the worst attack that's ever taken place on American soil occurred on 9/11, and it was launched effectively from Afghanistan. And the people that were responsible for it, Al-Qaeda with Taliban protection in Afghanistan, had to be dealt with. So the Americans had to go in. And if the Americans went in, the Brits had to do the same. The Brits had to be alongside them. We never forget, and can never forget, how many times the Americans have stood alongside us, and particularly in both world wars. So we were right to do that. I think one could argue about the tactics used at the time, and also the plan to stay in Afghanistan for as long as we did. The British Army in the 19th century fought 2 wars in Afghanistan and one in the early 20th century. And in each case, we went in with the specific intention of sorting out a problem we perceived, dealing with it, and getting out quick. I think the idea that you might stay in Afghanistan in the long term is possibly, as may have been proven by recent events, is perhaps a mistake. But the reality is, I think, that if you're dabbling in a situation like Afghanistan, you have to be ready to go back in again if it gets out of hand. And I think one of the key things is, and it's an interesting situation for any military commander there who has been responsible for troops, some of whom have been killed in action in Afghanistan. Was your time wasted there? Was it a waste of time? The answer is no, because, as I mentioned, that attack, 9/11, was launched from Afghanistan. There hasn't been any major attack against the West launched from Afghanistan since, because of US, British and Allied forces' presence there. So it has achieved its goal, but I think the question about how we go forward there is one that's very much open to debate. I don't believe that we're going to be facing a peace deal, a realistic peace deal between the Taliban and let's say, the US or the Afghan government. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think we are going to be looking at a situation of conflict as time goes forward.
So now I want to understand, at what point are you aware of the IDF? And you heard the way I introduced you, and you know, people we all have very short memories, Richard. But the Goldstone report, which just vilified the state of Israel and the IDF going after Hamas in Gaza. And you came out very strongly trying to correct what you thought were inappropriate, inaccurate distortions of how the IDF operates. Before we go to that moment, how do you become first even knowledgeable, aware of, have contact with the Israeli army, the IDF?
Well, my first exposure, shall we say, to the IDF was obviously, like most people, on the television when I was a boy at school, and various wars that Israel was fighting in the 70s and the late 60s. And we watched it and saw it. And as I mentioned, my father was very pro-Israel, and he would speak about it, and it got my interest. And I was going to be a soldier anyway when I left school, so I was interested in it.
And what years was this, roughly?
Well, sort of, I suppose, from probably 67 onwards.
So you remember, do you remember the Six-Day War?
Yeah. So from 67, really, yeah.
Okay.
And 73, those wars, and various other sort of sporadic conflicts that occurred in the interim.
Okay, but at that point you hadn't had personal contact.
No, it was purely, I was a young boy then, so
yes.
It was on television. And in the papers, I avidly read the papers. And it was a discussion at school. When I was at school, this was, you know, what the latest Israeli conflict was always a hot discussion at school.
Really, in what context? Was it in criticism or in sympathy?
I think to a large extent criticism, but not the level of criticism that later developed. At that time, it was, I think there was, you know, the media were critical, even then, and I think, you know, that was reflected and transferred onto the school kids and the teachers in particular. I mean, most teachers in Britain, not all, but most of them are on the left, and they were then. And I think the left then had begun to oppose Israel more than support it, as they'd done previously.
And as you remember, to the extent to which you can, you're in school and you're hearing this from your teachers. Did they influence you, or were you saying to yourself, "This doesn't feel right"? My
father influenced me. If he had criticised them heavily, then I might have been more open to that. But no, absolutely, I didn't take any notice of what the teachers said about that, because I knew they didn't know, and I knew they were on the wrong page there. But when I joined the army, as I say, I left school, joined the army. We studied the IDF probably more closely than any other army that we studied, even the US Army. Why? Because at that time, in the sort of late 70s, we were planning the whole focus of the British Army, as was the American Army at the time, was to defend Western Europe against a potential threat from Russia. So we were planning on fighting armoured warfare against the invading Russian army. And the only army at the time that was using armoured warfare effectively were the Israelis. So we studied every battle. I could have named you then, every battle, every general, every tank almost of the IDF in all of their armoured battles. And it's true to say that I think most British soldiers then and today have huge admiration for the IDF. Because they're not like kind of TV audiences that listen to what the BBC says and believe it. They've fought the same type of enemy themselves in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, even, dare I say it, Northern Ireland, which is similar kind of conflict. And they understand what the IDF does and why they do it, and they have huge admiration for the IDF. I don't remember meeting any serving or retired British soldier who doesn't feel that way.
Mm-hmm. And when do you have personal contact for the first time?
I think the first time was when I was commanding a platoon in Northern Ireland. We had a visit from an IDF general who came to see how we did things. And I didn't see much of him. He came out, I briefed him, we spoke, and he went away again. But that was probably the first time. the next time after that really was I was on a training course, at what we call the staff course, which is where you go to train to be a more senior officer in the early 90s. And on that course was an Israeli brigadier general as a student. So that was I had quite a lot to do with him, and that was the main contact I have with him.
That's how it begins.
Yeah, pretty much.
And then what?
Well, there isn't, unlike the American forces, there isn't much direct interaction between the British Army and the Israeli Army. So I didn't have, apart from those two occasions, I didn't really have much to do with them. But later, when I was working in number 10 Downing Street for the Joint Intelligence Committee in the Cabinet Office, which is effectively the Prime Minister's office in the UK, I had a lot of dealings, particularly with Mossad. Mossad had a station in London and still does, and I was working on intelligence, international terrorism intelligence, and an obvious very close partner was Mossad, and so I worked a great deal with them, and also with other defense intelligence elements as well from Israel over that time, and I developed a close relationship with those people.
Okay, and if someone were to say to you, Richard, I have enormous regard for your personal service to Great Britain, to the UK, and what you did at 10 Downing Street. And it's nice that you say nice things about the IDF, but how do you know anything? You know, why would you go public with the degree of defense that you have gone public with? You've been a vocal defender of the State of Israel and the IDF. How do you, if in fact you didn't say to me, yeah, you know, I was ultimately in joint operations, or I served for a time in Israel, what? No. I say to you, what is it? And you tell me some nice stories, but if somebody were to say to you, what gives you the ability, the credentials, what gives you even the right to speak on behalf of what Israel is, what the IDF is, the morality of the IDF? But I'm sure many of the people who are watching right now know. Richard Kemp said after Goldstone, there was no army in the world that was as moral as the State of Israel. When you said that, it was like heaven speaking to the Jewish people in the State of Israel. Because it wasn't a Jew saying it. It was Richard Kemp, a distinguished commander of the British Army. So those words you spoke were iconic in terms of Israeli history at a given point in time, when they were just the most wonderful things you could have said and taken. And now I'm saying to you, and somebody who disagrees with you says, hey, Richard, what right do you have? What's your knowledge base? What's your experience? You would say.
Well, trust me, I get questioned in that way a lot, but in a rather more aggressive way than you question me. Because, of course, if you're not Jewish and you're saying something other than condemnation of the IDF, you're obviously being paid by somebody to say it. You know, there's got to be some horror behind it all. But the reality is that I made many visits to Israel and to the IDF in the time between while I was working in Downing Street, working for the Cabinet Office. I visited Israel in that capacity, and afterwards made many visits and saw and experienced the IDF in action, and also devoted a lot of time studying what they were doing. And I think the thing that enables me to be so positive, and actually the words I said back then over the Goldstone report, if anything, my conviction has increased dramatically since then. I think the thing that really gives me the ability to do it, having observed the IDF and seen the IDF and got to know them and studied them carefully, is that I spent 30 years doing exactly what they're doing. So even if I hadn't been out there and you show me a report saying this or that, I know what's right and what's not right. 30 years fighting the same kind of conflict, mostly terrorism, not all terrorism, mostly fighting terrorism. So I think you'd have to be pretty stupid to look at what the IDF were doing and not come to the conclusion that I came to, either stupid or malign.
Although many people don't come to your conclusion?
Well, many people who have the same kind of experience as I do come to that conclusion, but they're not the kind of people who then will speak out about it, because of course it's not an easy or a comfortable thing to do.
Yes.
I mean, I was taught right from wrong when I was a child, and I knew what was right and what was wrong, and what the right thing to do was and the wrong thing to do. And also, I had very good reason to see the IDF as our very close friends and allies because of the experience I'd had working with them and other members of the Israeli government apparatus. So even though it was uncomfortable and it was contrary to public received opinion, I felt obliged to speak up for them, as I would have felt obliged to speak up if it was my own soldiers that were being criticised wrongly, as the Israelis were. So, but that doesn't apply to everybody. I think many people won't see it in quite that light, and also, many British soldiers who see things the same as I do. They fought lots of battles. They go into retirement. They obviously can't speak out when they're serving still, but they go into retirement. They don't want to be fighting more battles if they don't have to. And quite a few of them also end up working for Arab countries, and therefore it's not necessarily healthy in commercial terms to be speaking out in connection with Israel. So I think that's probably the reality, rather than the fact that others don't see it in the same way as I do.
Very interesting. You remember the Goldstone whole incident? For any of our viewers who either are too young or just don't remember, I want you to take us through why the Goldstone report was written, what it said that bothered you, and then what happened when you, Richard Kemp, went public basically condemning aspects of that Goldstone report. Tell the story in your own words.
Okay. Well, the Goldstone report was commissioned by the United Nations Human Rights Council after the 2007-8 conflict in Gaza, after Hamas had been firing multiple rockets into Israel, Israeli civilians, and Israel had been obliged eventually to go in and deal with that situation. And of course, we've seen that very, very same situation unfold time and again since, including very recently. And Judge Goldstone was commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate Israel's war crimes, which I think the mandate he was given was actually already a slanted mandate against Israel.
Yes. And it wasn't to investigate war crimes during this conflict.
No.
It was already assumed in the way the report was framed that Israel had committed war crimes. Okay.
That was an assumption.
Yes.
And he found that to be true. And those of us who kind of keep an eye on these things knew that was what he was going to say anyway. He did a detailed report, and he concluded that Israel had committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, in particular by killing civilians in Gaza.
Targeting them, correct?
Targeting, either carelessly or deliberately targeting them and then killing them and wounding them.
And disproportionate force?
Yeah, that was part of it. Disproportionate force against a civilian population in response to what often were described as fireworks being fired out of Gaza, which of course is not true any more than it is in the recent volleys.
And when we talk of disproportionate force, it's been explained to us that it really is a technical term. There's a lay understanding of what disproportionate force is, and there's a military understanding, an international understanding. When Goldstone was investigating Israel, was his perspective the classical military perspective on disproportionate force, or was it, do you feel, the common notion, if Israel had more guns and more planes and more bullets, and they fired more bullets, and they had planes, and Hamas did not have planes, that was disproportionate force? As you look back at it, from your sense, what did he mean? What did the report mean by the term disproportionate force when it claimed Israel responded to rockets after rockets after rockets with disproportionate force?
Well, I think as the UN have repeatedly done in the case of the Goldstone report. It was the kind of popular view of proportionality, whereas proportionality, as you kind of allude to, really is very much a specific term explained in international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, which soldiers understand. They have to understand it because they've got to adhere to it. And Judge Goldstone did have a military advisor. He had a retired Irish Army colonel as his military advisor. As far as I can see, there was no evidence from any of his team that they understood what they were writing about because it was all false. And I think one point that often people don't necessarily think about is that it wasn't just criticism that was a bit offline. It was the diametric opposite of the reality. Hamas, the terrorists who were trying to kill innocent civilians from behind the human shields of innocent civilians, a double war crime, were given a free pass. And Israel was accused of disproportionate force, was accused of crimes against humanity, war crimes, when Israel did every single thing it possibly could, more than most armies in the history of warfare have done to try and prevent the deaths of innocent civilians or wounding of innocent civilians on the battlefield. So it wasn't just a little bit offline, it was the diametric opposite.
What are examples of the way Israel handled itself that you would say it tried to protect civilians not only in a remarkable way, but in some instances as it had never been done before? Explain to our audience what it is that really impresses you about the IDF ethic when it comes to warfare.
I think that there's a couple of issues here. First of all, the IDF have better than most military forces, better intelligence. They have better intelligence capability. Obviously, Britain and America also have very good intelligence capability. I would say that Israel is better still. Part of the reason for that is not just because of their great capability, it's also because they're dealing in an area in Gaza, which is a very small area compared to many of the operational areas that we have fought in, places like Afghanistan and Iraq. A very small area, and they've been focusing it and studying it and looking at it for a long, long time. So they have an intimate understanding of the situation there. And they have very, very good intelligence sources there, both technical and also human intelligence on the ground. So that's kind of one aspect of it all, which gives them an edge over most other armies. And secondly, I think they do undoubtedly have a moral ethos, which is not the same as the moral ethos of other armies. And I think there are two reasons for it, to be honest. And when I say this, I'm not being critical of the US Army or the British Army, because both of our armies have extremely high moral standards. The Israeli army is a bit different because, one, it is made up of conscripts. These conscripts, really, they don't want to be fighting. They don't want to be in the army, most of them. Some would be professional soldiers, most not. Most of them want to be doctors, they want to run high techs, they want to be television interviewers, they want to be rabbis, they want to be, they want to be road menders, whatever it is, a range of things like everyone else does. That's what they want to be doing. Whereas if you join the British or American army, you want to fight, you want to be a fighting soldier. And I think that gives a different mentality. It gives a slightly more gung-ho attitude among other professional armies. And I think that has an effect of restraint on Israeli soldiers. And the second thing is, and I say this as a Roman Catholic, but is Judaism. We all know, I think, that most Israelis are not practicing Jews. But we also know, those of us who spend any time in Israel really, we know that Judaism has such an extraordinary influence on pretty much every aspect of society, including the army. And it has an influence on the army far greater than, for example, Christianity today has on the British Army. In the past, yes, it would have done, but today it is almost negligible influence. And I think that the moral standards of Judaism make a big difference. And those two things combined, I think, lead to a pretty unique ethos in the IDF.
Okay, that's the ethos. Now I want to know how it translates into strategy. What does the Israeli army do that impresses you? Again, it's a hard word to use in the context of war, but morally. There are things that Israel will and will not do And I want you to tell me from your perspective what they do or don't do that impresses you.
Right. Well, I think one thing that the Israeli forces do, which goes beyond most forces, is the level of control of offensive operations. And again, it's made slightly easier for them because of the very small defined area they're operating in. It's not. I don't say easy lightly, because of course no military situation is really easy, particularly if you've got military targets in among civilian targets, which makes it very complicated. But nevertheless, they've got a small area, and they will never launch, except in extremis, and extremis doesn't really happen that often. They will never launch an attack on an area where there are civilians without getting the highest level of authorization, with legal advice as well. So they will, for example, either the commander or the deputy commander of the Israeli Air Force will be present in the command center before an airstrike occurs, and one of those two individuals will give their direct approval for an airstrike before it happens.
Is this unusual?
This is unusual, to say the least. Normally it will be a much lower level of authorization. And you know, you then carry on down the chain, whereby, for example, I spoke to an Israeli Air Force pilot during one of the recent conflicts in Gaza, who'd just come back from an attack mission against terrorists in Gaza, and he'd tried to attack a single target several times, and had not been able to, because each time he'd realized there were civilians in the target vicinity, and eventually he aborted the attack, and the terrorists that they were trying to kill didn't get killed. And I said to him, that must have been deeply frustrating. And this man, who was Scottish actually, he was a Scotsman who was flying in the IDF, in Israeli Air Force, Scottish Jew, he said to me, it isn't frustrating. He said, I'm a father and a husband. He said, when I go home at night, I need to be able to, I don't need to be in a position where I'm telling my wife and kids that I've unnecessarily killed people or killed innocent civilians. And I wouldn't want to do that. So, and he said the IDF give me the decision not to strike if I feel it's wrong to do so. The other kind of areas that they excel in are targeting individual areas with information. In other words, telling by phone, by text message, by leaflet drop, telling people to get out.
That's all real.
All real.
If somebody is that just, you know, some kind of apocryphal story about it?
It's true. They will drop thousands of leaflets. They will make tens of thousands of phone calls, text messages, radio broadcasts, telling them to get out. If none of that works and they still want to go ahead with a strike and there are still civilians there, they've developed a harmless explosive device they can drop on top of a building to make a loud bang and warn people finally to get out. So they'll go well above and beyond to try and hit their target and deal with the enemy they've got to deal with without killing innocent civilians.
Okay, so if this is all true, why do so many in the international community act as if Israel is just full of people who delight in shooting at children, shooting at medical personnel, shooting at civilians? Why?
It's a good question, which I'm often asked, and there are a number of reasons for it, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'll talk through some of the things I think. One of which is that I do consider this to be the greatest slur campaign in the history of the world, the slur campaign against Israel. And it started off, of course, among Arab states in particular, who opposed, and still in many cases oppose, the existence of a Jewish state in what they consider to be the Arab world. And that message was spread through their supporters and followers around the world, and taken up in schools, universities, think tanks, international organizations like the United Nations, the EU, etc., and took hold. And it sort of almost became without any cause at all, apart from prejudice and hate for the Jews and the Jewish state, became accepted by people who should know better but are actually ignorant. And many people actually believe it. There are many people, of course, who know it's not true but want it spread, but many people believe it. And I've met them in both of those categories. The level of ignorance about Israel by people who express an opinion on Israel is staggering, absolutely staggering. And I think that's a large amount of it. There's obviously traditional anti-Semitism. And in countries like Britain, Britain has a history of anti-Semitism. I would say anti-Semitism among the indigenous population in Britain is nothing like it used to be, I'm thankful to say. But it still exists, there's still residual anti-Semitism there. And we have in Britain a very large Islamic population now. And I certainly would not condemn Muslims out of hand, but what I do know, and I know many Muslims, is that most Muslims, certainly most Muslims I know, and most Muslims I read about and hear about and see, they're almost sort of brought up with a hatred of Israel. And that is then taken up in some cases by the host population in Britain, by politicians who want their votes. They will then appease this view, this anti-Israel view. And one classic example of that, of course, is our Labour Party today, which is led by a chap called Jeremy Corbyn, who is absolutely desperate to harvest the votes of people who hate Israel. And I think that the other kind of linked reason is that we suffer a great deal in Europe these days from Islamic terrorist attacks of different sorts, bomb attacks, shootings, ramming attacks with cars, knifings. Quite a lot have occurred over recent years. And a lot of people believe that, because they know that part of the message of Islamic terrorists is an anti-Israel message. And so a lot of these political leaders and others believe that by appeasing this anti-Israel feeling, there'll be less likely to be attacks against us.
When you were a commander, did every single person under you act properly?
No.
Isn't that because they're people?
Yeah, and
Okay.
that's true of every army in the world.
Okay. What I often hear also is, and now let's go to the West Bank, what I call the West Ridge. So there are people who say Israel is brutalizing the Palestinians on the West Ridge. They are not letting them live their life. They can't travel freely. There are checkpoints. And at a checkpoint, even if a checkpoint is okay, people will say to me, why is it that, 3-4 Israeli people, teenagers or in their early 20s, they make people stand out in the sun for a while and they're smoking a cigarette and they won't let them pass, or they'll just harass an older person, they'll harass somebody who's pregnant. And when that happens, the criticism is not of that soldier, but of the IDF as a whole. And the reason I asked you, did anybody under you act improperly, is that we understand that in any army, there are going to be a whole host of personalities, some of whom are just obnoxious and really can do things that you and I would be very critical of. And for me, and then you'll tell me whether you agree with me or not, for me, that's not ever the test. It's never a test about what an individual soldier does. What I'm interested in is, what is the policy? And what is the command from on high? And when a soldier really does go off the rails, does the system adequately respond as best it can? And what I see happening is that when I look at the state of Israel, do I know that there are Israeli soldiers who sometimes act inappropriately? Absolutely. And it pains me. But what gives me, in some way, elevates me, is how I see the Israeli people, how the IDF itself, how the system, how the society acts. So that when an Israeli soldier does something, by and large, that is inappropriate, the system doesn't applaud them, doesn't give them a pass. And for me, is the last thing I'll say about this. For me, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. And one of the most traumatic moments in our life, America's life, is My Lai 4, where in Vietnam, it turns out, under a Lieutenant Calley, there seems to be a massacre of a Vietnamese village. And it is horrific. But Calley isn't made a hero. Calley is made scum and ultimately is brought to justice. And there is universal American outrage. And similarly, when something happens in Israel that is so morally heinous, and it happens from time to time, the response of the IDF, of the Israeli people, of the Israeli government is shame and outrage and a statement and even an apology to the victims. So for me, that's the test. And I want to know the extent to which you think I'm being fair in my analysis and whether that resonates with you and what you'd say about it.
Yeah. Well, Mark, you're being fair, and you're absolutely right, and you echo my views on this. And you started out by saying, did my men ever do anything wrong? And the answer is yes, they did, many times, many of them. And there's two reasons for it, really, by and large. One of which is if they are either if they're malign, or if they just can't be bothered, they don't care, and they will be, they will do the wrong thing. Or secondly, if they make a mistake, and they might be a very good soldier, but they've made a mistake, and we all make mistakes in our life. I've made several mistakes today already, and no one's trying to kill me. I don't think. Well, they probably are, but not that I know of. So, if you're a soldier in battle, or even on patrol in Judea and Samaria, and you're under great pressure, you're in danger. Sometimes you'll see your mates killed alongside you. You'll be maybe tired, wet, hungry, cold, miserable, don't want to be there, and mistakes happen. So in either of those cases, whether it's due to someone's malignancy or evil intent, or because they've made a mistake, then the system deals with that. And certainly in my case, many times I've had to deal with soldiers in that sort of situation. You look at it differently if it's a mistake from if it's a deliberate bad act, but you deal with it. You don't tolerate it. You don't allow it. And I think the way that soldiers in the IDF and in the British and the American armies, in all three, to my personal knowledge, get dealt with is far more harshly than civilians making mistakes over anything. Even relatively minor things, because those of us who are military commanders know that if you let go by a relatively minor transgression, that can lead to a much more major one, and then you're back in the kind of My Lai massacre that you mentioned earlier on.
Mm-hmm. Are you offended by Israeli checkpoints on the West Ridge?
I'm no more offended by them than I was offended by British checkpoints in Northern Ireland and Afghanistan, Iraq. And I think I've been through checkpoints. I've been through Israeli checkpoints. I've been subjected to the same kind of scrutiny, the same stop and check, etc., as anyone else has. And no, I don't find it offensive. I understand why it happens, and I may not like the inconvenience, but I understand it. And I think most people who get offended by it are making a political point. Obviously, there are cases where you're unnecessarily and unduly held up, or you maybe feel humiliated or whatever. There are cases like that, but I think by and large it's an unfortunate necessity of the security threat that faces the state of Israel.
There are instances when in riots Israel uses rubber bullets. What's your sense of, are you critical when Israel uses rubber bullets? And I assume, by the way, a rubber bullet is not the same as a normal bullet, but if you get hit by a rubber bullet, and not only in the eye, anywhere, it's very unpleasant and can be hurtful to you. What's your sense of Israel's use of rubber bullets? Critical of it or not?
We use rubber bullets. We use them in Northern Ireland, we use them in the Balkans, we use them in various different countries as riot control means. And I believe that using rubber bullets is often the right thing to do, partly because it saves lives. Yes, it's painful if it hits you, and I've been hit by rubber bullets, and it's painful, but it's nothing like getting hit by a real bullet, I can assure you.
Yes.
So I support Israel's use of rubber bullets, and also other non-lethal methods that they use, like tear gas, for example. We also use tear gas. Riot batons, these things, a physical force that's necessary, short of lethal force, I think should be used wherever it possibly can be.
there are areas on the West Ridge where Palestinians are in total control of their society, their life, everything from schools and hospitals and media, and entire range of social and civic services. Israel retains one right, the right for the IDF to enter anywhere, any Palestinian city or village, when it thinks there is a terrorist activity in the making. And they can go into a home in the middle of the night and take somebody out of bed if they think this person is involved directly or indirectly with a terrorist act. Are you critical of that as a British soldier? Are you critical of that Israeli policy?
I'm not, because it was also the policy that we adopted in a number of different places.
Why is it necessary?
Most particularly in Northern Ireland, which is very similar to Judea.
Why is it necessary? Because
there is an ongoing and enduring threat against Israel from that area. And if the Israeli Defense Force didn't retain the ability to do that, the threat would develop and get worse, and Israeli citizens would be killed as a consequence. And so it is essential. And while we're on that subject, I don't believe in the foreseeable future that it's going to be possible to withdraw the IDF from there. I think even if in the unlikely event, and I do believe it's unlikely, I'm afraid, that the population, the Palestinian Authority and the population of the West Bank came to the conclusion that they want a peace with Israel, and I don't believe they do, but if they did, it's still not going to be possible for the IDF to pull out, because who else is going to get in there and exploit the weak security that will exist without the IDF, with the best will in the world? Iran. Iran is pulling the strings in Gaza at the moment. Iran is trying to attack Israel from every direction it can. It would certainly be in the West Bank, as it already is to an extent. The Islamic State, okay, we've seen that they're going through a difficult period at the moment. They will re-emerge in another form, and they will also try and use that as a launch pad against Israel. So Israel has to retain its security sovereignty, shall we say, in the West Bank.
In your mind, are the Palestinians the underdog, or is Israel the underdog?
I mean, when you look at it in the bigger picture, the Palestinians are part of a very big Arab world, and Israel is a tiny little country. And there's a lot of Arabs out there, even before the recreation of the State of Israel in 1948, who were not prepared to accept the presence of Jews, and certainly not Jews governing themselves, and certainly not Jews governing Arabs in any part of that land. So Israel is the underdog, without a doubt, and it's not just Arabs, it's also the Iranians as well, and a lot of the world opposed to it. But there is a big change, having said that, in the Middle East since the early days, and I've noticed it even in the last few years, whereby the threat from Iran has grown against the entire region. We've seen Iranian aggression, we see it almost daily against Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria. All around the region, we see Iran's imperial aggression. And other countries there, Arab countries, fear it. And because they fear Iran, they see Israel as their friends, because they believe that Israel is the only real power in that region anyway, which is going to protect them from Iran, or is going to actually do anything against Iran. And if you look at it now, with Iranian aggression that's been taking place in the Gulf region against some of our allies, the only country that's actually overtly reacted militarily is Israel. And Arab countries see that. And so I don't think they're ever going to kind of embrace Israel and see Israel as their great friends, but they do see a tactical advantage in being on side with Israel. And I've been in Saudi Arabia recently and have certainly got that message loud and clear from some of the people close to the government of Saudi.
At the Gaza border, recently, there have been attempts by Hamas to bring tens of thousands of people to the fence that separates Israel from Gaza, and to in some way breach that fence. They've also created ingenious ways of flying kites with some kind of incendiary devices that go over the fence and now into Israel. But the goal is to breach that fence and perhaps then to go to Israeli communities and actually murder Jews. At the same time, IDF forces are away from the fence and are in some way have taken action against the people on the other side of the fence. And so what people say is, why is Israel shooting at people on the other side of the fence? It's one thing if they actually breach the fence, but why doesn't Israel just stand there and let them, gather at that fence and make all the noise they want? And so what? What would you say to that?
I've been on that fence during some of the worst violence we've seen over the course of the last 18 months. I've not just been where the press are, where they can observe it. I've been right forward with the snipers, the Israeli snipers, with the commanders and the observers right on the very front. So I've seen exactly what they've done and how they've done it. And the reality is that those people on the fence line, the people from Gaza sent to the fence, they don't just spontaneously appear there. It's a military operation organised by Hamas with the intention of getting large numbers onto that fence line and breaking through. And they've got instructions. Some of them have been found with marked maps showing the route from a specific point on the fence to a specific community, like, for example, Nakalos. And they've given instructions. Once you break through, if you may have a weapon, fine, use that weapon. If not, pick any weapon up you want, a lump of rock, a stick, a knife, and use it to kill whatever Jews you find there. And that's the intention. And so by stopping them from actually breaking through the fence, actually, the IDF is saving lives. And it's dangerous for them to do it because they have to expose themselves in the act of dealing with this situation. It's dangerous for the soldiers. But if they didn't stop them before they got through the fence, when you got thousands in Israeli territory running riot towards villages, you're going to have to deal with them a lot more harshly than taking out some of the ringleaders on the fence. Hundreds would have to be killed there, far, far more than are killed when they're on their own side of the fence, tragically though that is. And I think, therefore, the Israeli Defense Force tactics there save the lives of innocent civilians, or perhaps in some cases not such innocent civilians, as they cost. So it's that I've looked at that situation. I'm aware of many criticisms of it. I've looked at it with a critical eye, as if to say, how would I do this? Is there a different way of doing it? And I can't think of one. And that's after 30 years of wrestling with this type of problem. And I'll say one additional thing on this, which is I've spoken there and had a coffee, etc., with a lot of young soldiers whose job is to protect Israel on that border. And I have the greatest admiration, not only for their professionalism, but also for their personal courage, because they're putting their lives at risk in doing that. And the way the IDF operates, very often, the innocent civilian lives on the other side have been saved, and Israeli lives have been cost, Israeli soldiers' lives have been cost in the process. And the risks they take, the dangers they put themselves in, many other armies in the world would never do that to save the lives of people on the enemy side. And I believe, contrary to the United Nations, the EU, many other countries' view, that the Israeli army should be vilified, should be condemned, I believe the IDF should receive the Nobel Peace Prize for the incredible work they do.
Israel endured thousands of rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel proper. It begins, we started with Sderot, but it now goes Ashkelon, Tel Aviv. And the argument is, yeah, but no one's getting killed. They're not sophisticated enough. Sometimes they'll hit a house. Sometimes most of the time they'll land in an empty field. Every now and then, very few people get killed. But when Israel responds, everybody is getting killed on the Palestinian side. To what extent does that argument persuade you? To what extent do you feel people are missing an essential ingredient here?
The most recent upsurge of violence, rockets being fired, as we're doing this, as we're talking today, there was something like 300 fired recently. And of that 300, 90% was stopped by Iron Dome. That means something that most people don't really think about a lot, which is that because 90% of that huge number of rockets was stopped by the Iron Dome defensive system, it meant that the IDF doesn't have to carry out a heavy bombing campaign in Gaza, which it would otherwise have to do. And so, because of the defense that Israel's got, Palestinian lives are being saved. The reality is, I've witnessed these missiles coming in. I've been present when they've been fired, when they've landed, and I've been into a house on 2 or 3 occasions, very soon after a rocket hit the house, and I've seen with my own eyes what could have happened so easily. In one case, a sort of 17-year-old girl had been alone in the house. She'd heard an attack warning. She just got into a safe room, a purpose-built safe room in that house, just got the door closed as it exploded. If she hadn't made it, she'd have been dead. I've seen the effects of explosives on human flesh before. She'd have been dead. So they're not unsophisticated. They're nothing like the kind of precision missile systems, fortunately, that are available to the IDF. But if they weren't being knocked out of the sky by Iron Dome, and if the Israelis didn't have such a sophisticated protective system, shelter system, then a lot more people would be killed than have been killed.
Do you ever say to yourself, because Israelis sometimes say it, why in the world haven't we just gone into Gaza and I don't know what the right verb is, taking care of things, ended this? Why is it that this happens over and over again? And I have 2 questions for you, as if you were in the Israeli cabinet. You're Minister of Defense now. Is there anything Israel should have done or should be doing? Or is the Gaza reality, and Israel simply has to live with the fact that periodically there will be hundreds, thousands of rockets fired into Israel, and then every now and then Israel will respond, but that Israel ultimately must live with this? Or, if Richard Kemp were Defense Minister of Israel, would you be saying to the Prime Minister, we must do X, Y, and Z to stop this from happening in the future?
And the first thing to say on that is that the IDF could destroy Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It would be a tough campaign. Israeli soldiers would die in the process. A lot of civilians would die in Gaza. But it could be done. The problem could be stopped like that over a period, I don't know, maybe of a week or 2 weeks or something like that. Hard to say. But it could be stopped. But, and you know, I'm not the only one that knows that. Prime Minister Netanyahu knows it. The Defense Minister knows it. The Chief of Staff of the IDF knows it. Why don't they do it? And the reason is pretty clear. There's two main reasons. One is because if they did that, they would then own Gaza. If they demolished what is effectively the administration of Gaza, Hamas, if they demolished that, annihilated it, Egypt's not going to run Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is not going to run Gaza. The United Nations isn't. There's only one people who are going to run Gaza, that's Israel, who would have to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza.
Yes, but there wouldn't be rockets flying into Israel.
You're right, but you would have an Israeli occupation force running Gaza.
And are you saying that on balance, it is better for Israel to live with this current threat and this rain of rockets? But unfortunately, I should say, unfortunately, it is better for Israel to live with the rockets than the alternative, which, as you'd see it, now Gaza is now your problem.
Yeah. I think that's not that. I believe that to be true, but also there's another aspect to it as well, which I think shouldn't be ignored, which is the fact that Israel faces multiple threats from all around. We saw attempts to attack Israel from Iraq. We've seen numerous attempts to attack Israel from Syria and from Lebanon, and Israel cannot afford to devote the huge military resources that would be necessary to control Gaza, and it would be enormous when it has these other threats to consider as well, on top of which it has to worry about the Iranian nuclear program. It cannot rest for a moment from its vigilance on Iran and its preparedness to do something about it if it gets to the point where Iran develops a viable nuclear weapon with a missile able to convey it to Israel. And that preparedness takes a great deal of military resources to make sure that the relevant aspects of the IDF are ready to do what's necessary. So I think diverting such a huge effort into Gaza, apart from the other downsides to it, would leave Israel exposed in other ways. So I believe that it's the least of a lot of evils that,
I
that
understand.
Israel would solve.
It's very helpful for us to hear it that way. Hezbollah, we understand, has 10,000 missiles aimed at Israel and could fire them anytime. Why haven't they? And again, you're a defense minister. How much does it frighten you? Do you do anything about it? What?
I was on the border there with Lebanon only a couple of weeks ago, and I was looking out from the Israeli side at the rockets. You can't obviously see the rockets with the naked eye, but you know which houses they're in, and they're in many, many houses in southern Lebanon. And there are tunnels, and I went into one of the tunnels that straddles the border with between Lebanon and Israel. And they are a very, very stark reality. They're there threatening Israel. Some of them are precision-guided missiles, which are able to hit precise targets. And they can hit targets over a very long range of depth into Israel. Why haven't they been used? Your question was. They haven't been used because they exist for one primary purpose, which is in the event that Israel carries out an attack on Iran, those missiles will be unleashed on Israel.
But only in that case?
That's their primary purpose. I'm not saying that they wouldn't be used in other circumstances, but what Iran doesn't want to do, and of course let's not forget that Iran controls Hezbollah's rockets there, what Iran doesn't want to do is expend them and waste them and then have no way of defending themselves against an Israeli attack against Iran.
Yes,
So,
when you say waste, you've just said there are many which are guided missiles.
some.
But they would do enormous damage to Israel.
Right, and there may come a time when they decide for different reasons that they want to use them, even if Israel doesn't attack Iran. But they're basically a deterrent. They are there to deter Israel. The problem is with it, one of the problems with this is that, and an attack from Lebanon by those missiles or by other means could be triggered almost as a miscalculation in some circumstances, and it has happened in the past. But however it works out, if it's in response to an Israeli attack or if it's for some other reason, that threat is so great from southern Lebanon that Israel will have to carry out a very, very heavy bombing campaign and send Israeli forces in on the ground into Lebanon, and a great number of civilians in southern Lebanon are going to die. And that's the reality of it, and it's there's no way around it. And it's not like Gaza, it's not relatively limited, can be contained really by the Iron Dome. It can't be contained by all of Israel's air defense missiles or systems. And when you think about it also, if there was a deliberate decision to unleash an attack from Lebanon, there's very likely they're going to be also unleashed from Gaza at the same time, possibly from other places like Yemen, where there are missiles, and Iraq, and indeed Syria, where long-range missiles capable of hitting Israel exist. So Israel could face a threat from not all sides, but pretty much all sides at the same time.
It sounds terrifying when you describe it that way.
It is terrifying, but one thing that encourages me, and I probably sound very pessimistic at the moment, but I'm actually very optimistic because I know that Israel has means of dealing with this, and I know that when they need to, they will deal with it.
Including all of the missiles in Lebanon.
They will be able to deal with it. I'm not saying there won't be casualties inside Israel, because there probably will be.
I understand.
But they will be able to deal with it.
It won't be the end of Israel.
It certainly won't be the end of Israel. And I think because Israel has such a powerful military capability, and also because Israel has a phenomenal friend called the United States of America. And the US, I believe, will stand alongside Israel if it is subjected to this kind of assault. I would like to say that Britain would as well. I don't know if I can say that with all honesty, but I know the US will stand. I'm not saying the US will necessarily fight alongside Israel, or indeed that Israel would want them to. I think Israel prefers to fight its own wars. But at least what we do know is that the US has a great deal of military power which can be provided to Israel if necessary. And some, there will be times maybe when Israel needs ammunition, etc., and America will provide it. And also a great deal of diplomatic strength, which will come to Israel's aid. So I recognise the threat, and I recognise the very real danger, but I also believe that Israel is strong enough to withstand that.
So tell me about your view of Iran. First of all, was the Iran deal a wise move for the West, or were you opposed to it? How do you feel about the fact that Donald Trump has withdrawn the U.S. from that deal? And if it ever was that Iran did begin to build a viable nuclear weapon that it could fire at Israel? There are some who argue even if they had a nuclear weapon, Iran would never use it. And then those who say, we can't take that chance. Israel must eliminate it as they did the Iraqi nuclear reactor, the Syrian nuclear reactor that Begin destroyed. And then there are people who say, Israel can't do it. It's a different world. It's a different country. It's underground. It's in rock. Even if Israel wanted to destroy Iran's nuclear program, it couldn't do it. So I want to hear you speak to all of that. Where do you stand on the Iranian nuclear threat against Israel?
Well, first of all, Israel did, in fact, destroy both the Iraqi and the Syrian nuclear programs, both of those, for which they were heavily criticized at the time. But subsequently, the world came to realize how grateful they were to Israel for doing it. Yes, the world's moved on. Things have changed. Technology's changed. Iranian sophistication is greater than anything Iraq or Syria had. To go back to your initial question, I think that the nuclear deal was a huge, huge mistake made by President Obama, a great miscalculation. And above all, what it did, it paved the way for an Iranian nuclear capability. It wasn't going to happen the next day, but it was a problem that was going to have to be addressed at some point. So I was right. I felt it was right that President Trump pulled the plugs on that and then put the pressure back onto Iran in terms of very severe sanctions. I do believe that Iran is intent now on developing a nuclear weapon as much as it ever was, and it will continue to be intent on that. I was recently in Israel where I received a briefing on the nuclear archive that Mossad seized a few months back, an incredible operation that snatched it from under the noses of the Iranians, which confirmed not just that Iran was breaking the nuclear deal at the time, but also that they were breaching the non-proliferation treaty that they were signatories to. So nothing can be believed about what they say. No deal can be worth the paper it's written on when you're dealing with this Iranian regime. Another issue that's sort of linked to it, which President Obama sort of conveniently ignored, was that the reward for Iran signing up to the deal led to the release of vast quantities of money, of their resources back to them, which had been seized, which has enabled a lot of their imperial aggression in the region, a lot of their support to Assad in Syria, their attempts to arm their militias in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and so on. A lot of that's been made possible by all that money released under the nuclear deal. So that's another reason why it was a big mistake and has caused a lot of suffering and death in that region and will do in the future. In terms of whether Iran would actually use it or not, I think you'd have to be an incredibly brave or stupid man to say, I wouldn't use a nuclear missile if I had it, so the Ayatollahs aren't going to use it. Well, someone who said that doesn't know the Ayatollahs. They don't see life or human life or casualties in the same context as we do. And you have to assume if they have it, they will be prepared to use it. And I believe personally that they would be prepared to use it. I believe that Israel will destroy their nuclear weapon system if they get to the point where they are capable of operating.
Israel has that ability.
Israel has that ability.
Without using nuclear weapons itself?
Without using nuclear weapons. It would do that without starting a nuclear war. I also believe that the United States might well take military action. If intelligence was such that it came to the point where it needed to do so, where it recognized that the nuclear threat was very real, because it's not just a nuclear threat to Israel, it's a nuclear threat to the world if it develops in that way.
Would that happen regardless of whether there was a Democratic or Republican administration in the White House?
I think it would very much depend on who was the president of the United States at the time. I think under the current presidency, I would be pretty confident that action would be taken if it became necessary. Obviously, apart from yourself, very few of us are able to foresee the future. So I can't say what will happen if President Trump is not president in a few years' time.
Mm-hmm. And while I'm asking, again, this is a little bit of a digression, but you're here, I can't not ask you. I want you to assess for me the military threat of A, Putin's Russia, and B, China.
The threats from Russia and China are significant, more significant today than they've been for a very long time, particularly from China. And Russia is an immediate problem for Europe, of course, because President Putin has been encroaching on different parts of Europe and being aggressive, and has seen very little response from Europe. Yes, we've deployed some forces, the Americans have deployed some forces in Eastern Europe as a signal being sent, a message being sent, but no real action has followed their kind of swallowing up of parts of Ukraine.
Are you including Great Britain?
Yeah, yeah.
Great Britain has something to fear from Russia.
We all do. We all do. The Russian army, the Russian armed forces are, I wouldn't say they're irrelevant, but compared to the United States, they're very low level. If you put the US and Russian forces against each other, there's no question as to the outcome. The trouble is that today, Russia has become adept at using their forces in a pretty unconventional way, and so they will often deploy military forces in the guise, for example, of a private military group or people in uniforms which are unmarked, and deny it's Russian action. And it's much more difficult to deal with that kind of situation. The Iranians also are adept at doing the same thing and using proxies. And I think that we're seeing the consequences in the Middle East now of Russia basically being given free rein by a West that doesn't really have the courage to stand up to Russia. And it was, I think, during President Obama's presidency that Russia first moved into Syria and gained dominance in Syria, and is now expanding and spreading that. So I think, it's really too late now to confront that situation. It's a situation that exists.
In that context, by the way, were you critical of President Trump's decision to withdraw American troops from Syria, whether it was for the Kurds or for this larger issue that you've defined vis-a-vis Russia?
I think that President Trump's decision to pull out the troops was, I would say, an understandable decision. A lot of people have said that the US betrayed its Kurdish allies in the process, but then you have to look at what the stakes are. First of all, who are the Kurdish allies? The Kurdish allies are actually, in a different name, the PKK, a Kurdish terror group designated as terrorists by the United States and other countries around the world, who have carried out attacks inside Turkey. Numerous people have been killed by this organization. Turkey is not going to simply allow that group to solidify its position on their borders. And so whatever President Trump did or didn't do, I think Turkey would have dealt with those Kurds. And I think President Trump was right not to allow a situation which occurred, which would have seen Americans caught in the middle. And the second consideration, I think, that has to be made is, which is more important, US relations with a group of Kurds in Syria or US relations with Turkey? And a lot of people don't like Turkey at the moment, and the Turkish regime is not particularly admirable at the moment. But nevertheless, Turkey is an extremely powerful and important country, and it's better to try and, I think, change the way that Turkey operates and that Turkey acts and Turkey's relationship with the West than it is to alienate Turkey altogether.
Okay, China.
China is a future massive problem that's building up, and I think China is getting to the stage now with its activities, for example, in the South China Sea, where it's trying to establish a level of sovereignty that doesn't really exist there in a critical trading area, building its own trade links and its trading networks across the world. China's getting economic dominance, not necessarily by military force at the moment, but by technology and also by an incredible economic presence across the world. So I think it's something that has to be pushed back whenever it can be pushed back. And I'm not suggesting we're using military force here, but for example, the trade war against China, I think, is the right move to make, because China is going to threaten us. We cannot afford to have a country like China which dominates everything.
So I asked you before, how do you handle a certain kind of criticism? Same kind of question, but from a different perspective. If somebody now has listened to us, this conversation, and they say to you, they meet you as you leave the building, "Hey, Richard, you are really a right-wing conservative on every issue. No matter what you discussed on L'chaim, you came out against Obama, against the Iran deal. You are supportive of Trump's withdrawing from Syria. You take Israel's side over the Palestinians. Are you basically a conservative ideologue?"
I've always been apolitical. That may sound unconvincing, but I've never belonged to a political party. I've never supported any particular political party. And as a soldier, you pretty much have to be non-political. You can't be aligned to one political party or other, really, in Britain anyway. So I don't consider myself to be either left or right. I don't associate with any party. What I do is look at all of these situations we've discussed from my experience and with my insight into it, and I come to my conclusions. Now, that they may coincide with one particular agenda rather than another, but it's not because I'm an ideologue. And just one point that I wanted to make in relation to something you said there was that I side with Israel over the Palestinians. I don't really side with Israel over the Palestinians. I side also with the Palestinians, but I believe that the Palestinians are the victims of their own highly irresponsible, murderous leadership. And I would like to see the Palestinians have a prosperous and a quiet and a peaceful life and to live alongside the Israelis. But I don't think that is ever going to be achieved with the leadership they have now. I think their leadership throughout virtually their entire history has betrayed them and will continue to betray them unless people are prepared to stand up against it. The more people appease them, the more the United Nations say they are the innocents and Israel are the guilty, the more their leadership is going to be encouraged to continue the action which causes such death and suffering and poverty among the Palestinian people.
So sum it up for us. We started by saying you have a perspective on what the IDF is from a lifetime of experience, and you've described to us how you've been inside Israel with the IDF at various places. You're bringing firsthand experience, knowledge, and relationships. What is it that you want the American people to understand about how Israel conducts itself militarily through the IDF?
I think the most important thing is that we should all recognize, not just the Americans, but perhaps even more so the Europeans, is that we're all in the same fight. We're all fighting against Islamic jihadism, against a phenomenon, a global phenomenon that is out to get us. And that obviously was exemplified in the greatest and worst possible way on 9/11, but there have been numerous examples since then. And Israel faces the same threat. Israel's issue is not just a territorial issue. This is an ideological issue against Israel, against the existence of Israel. And Israel is fighting on the same side as us. And in many cases, it's fighting our fight. It's at the sharp end. It's at the pointed end. And therefore, any one of us who feel that we want to defend ourselves, I think we have a duty to stand by Israel, to give whatever support we can, whether it's moral support or any other form of support that's available to us, to the state of Israel, which is fighting for its survival. I don't doubt it will survive, but it's fighting for its survival. And I think a comment that has been made in the past is, if Israel goes down, we all go down. And I really do believe that to be true.
You are fabulous.
Thank
Do
you.
you know the word neshama in Hebrew? Do you know the word neshama?
No.
Neshama means soul.
Oh.
You have a wonderful, beautiful neshama.
Thank you.
I wish you, in Hebrew we say, kol tuv v'hatzlacha. You should only have goodness in your life and success wherever you go. You have to promise me, if there's another occasion that you and I can sit at this table, you will do it. If so, I'll let go of your hand.
I promise.
And again, anytime we can learn from you, you are marvelous.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Richard.
very much.
Thank you
I
very,
appreciate
very
it.
much. Thank you.
And I would say about you, you're a fantastic interviewer.
Thank you.
One of the best. I've done a lot of interviews, but I always think, and it's not I think, I know, that a good interview is not about the interviewee, it's about the interviewer. So thank you.
It's about you, but thank you. I am very flattered and thank you. Richard Kemp, retired colonel of the British Army, a decorated war veteran, a brilliant strategist, most highly respected leader in the war against terror, and a courageous and most vocal defender of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and the State of Israel. It's been an honor for me having him here on L'Chaim. I hope you enjoyed getting to know him and hearing his perspective. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have about any ideas expressed here on this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. And remember, you can now take L'Chaim with you anywhere you go, L'Chaim Podcast. Just go to iTunes or Google Play, wherever you download your podcasts, and take L'Chaim with you. And so until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.